Hi there, welcome to Lilly-Tree. Today we're going to be making this bracelet, which is a revision of the very first tutorial I ever did, using thicker wires to make it larger. So let's get wrapping. For this project, we need 1.5mm diameter copper wire, which is 14 gauge, 0.4mm diameter copper wire, which is 26 gauge, an 8mm bead, some chain, some jumprings, and a clasp. I'm going to make my clasp out of the 1.5mm wire, but you could use a ready-made one. And the tools we need are chain or flat nose pliers, bail making or round nose pliers, wire cutters, a hammer and block, and optionally a permanent pen, and if you're making your own clasp, a torch and some tweezers. So we're going to start with 20 centimetres or 8 inches of the 1.5mm 14 gauge wire. And we want to bend that in the middle of the wire. We want a nice clean crease. So we'll fold it over on itself and just leave a small gap between the two wires. Then if we turn that wire 90 degrees, we can use the bail making pliers, or the thickest part of the round nose pliers, to bend both wires around, and then continue with the top wire. Then we want to take each side of that bend in a pair of flat nose or chain nose pliers and just separate those wires slightly so that we're creating a point. We can then mould that outer wire into the basic shape that we want. Just tighten the curve on that inner wire a bit. And it's worth spending a bit of time getting that curve just how we want it, just so it looks like a nice smooth shape. And at this point we can check to see that the bead fits. There should be a slight gap around it to allow for the weaving wire. And then we can decide how long we want that shape to be. Use the tip of our round nose pliers to create a small loop in the outer wire. And then the smallest section on the bail making pliers, or you can use a bit lower down the round nose pliers, just to make a slightly larger loop at the end of the inner wire that'll sit below that first loop. Then we can trim the excess off of those loops. And make sure they're closed up and flat. And that's our basic shape made. And we could leave it like this because this thicker wire is quite sturdy anyway. But hammering will help work harden the piece, and we can use it for design purposes as well. So just avoiding the point where we've got two wires sitting on top of each other, we can hammer around the shape. Just till we're happy how it looks. And then we're ready to start wire wrapping. It's useful at this point to work out exactly how this is going to sit as a bracelet, and for that we can just use a straight line and line up our shape. This is best done on the back. We'll be using that loop at the bottom as an attachment point, so that needs to be on the line. And once we've decided how we want the shape to sit, we can make a mark with permanent pen on the top wire. This is where we'll need to leave a gap in the weaving. Then we're going to take 1.5 meters of the 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire. And before we start weaving, it can also be useful just to thread the bead onto the end of that wire and mark where the wire will be sitting, just so remember this is where we need to thread on the bead. Then we can start by putting the end of our weaving wire through the point of our frame, and we just want to leave a space at the very point of that frame where we're going to thread the bead on. And then we'll wrap around the top inner wire twice. And just make sure those wires are sitting nicely together and we've left that gap right at the tip. And we'll take the weaving wire through between those two frame wires and then over and wrap that bottom outer frame wire twice. Then we can go back over to the inner wire and wrap that twice again. It is possible to use the open ends of the shape for this, but it can be just as fiddly as threading the wire through at this stage. So it's worth experimenting, but just use whichever method works best for you. We'll then go back over to the outer frame wire, and we're just beginning to get to the point where we need more wraps on the outer wire to keep up with the wraps we're making on the inner wire. But I think I can keep with 2 wraps for now. Then go back over to the inner wire and 2 wraps. And at this point we can increase the wraps on the outer wire to 3. Now each curve can be slightly different, so the number of wraps you need on the outer wire to keep up with that wrapping on the inner wire can vary a bit. And if you want to know more about wire wrapping around a curve, I've got a PDF to describe it in more detail. You can get a hold of that using the link at the top of the video or in the description below. For this curve, I kept the wraps on the inner wire at 2 and increased the outer wire to compensate, up until where it opened out a little bit and I increased the wraps inside to 3. So we just want to wrap up to where we've got that first mark on the inner wire. So we're ready to put the bead on. We can trim off the excess wire that we started with. Then we can put 1 wrap on the inner wire. Thread on the bead. Take that weaving wire over the top of the frame wire at that point, and then thread it through the point on the frame and back through the bead. We need to make sure that's nice and tight and neat. And then we'll continue our wrapping with the extra couple of wraps on that inner frame wire. And then back over to the outer frame wire. And we'll continue the wrap to near where we have the mark on the outer wire. And we want to leave a gap on the weaving on that outer wire, so our weave will begin again around about here. So we're just going to wrap around the inner wire up to that point. Then we can go across to the outer wire again and continue our weave. And just before I made that break, I've got 6 wraps on the outer wire. So I'm going to continue with 6 wraps again, and 3 on the inner wire at this point. And we'll just continue the weave around the rest of that frame. Because the curve's flattening out, we'll be reducing the number of wraps on that outer wire as we go, up to the point where we've got an even number on both wires. In my case, I'm putting 3 on both wires. And then we'll just continue wrapping 3 times on the inner wire and 3 times on the outer wire. Down to where we meet that first loop. And then we can finish off by just wrapping that inner wire down to the second loop. Trim off our excess and make sure that end's nice and flush. And that's our weaving finished, and we're ready to make the clasp and assemble the bracelet. For this bracelet, I'm going to use a ready-made chunky chain. But if you want to make your own chain, check out the original tutorial, which I'll leave in the description below. So first let's make the clasp. And we want to take a short length of the 1.5mm or 14 gauge wire and just ball the end with a torch. We'll let that cool and clean it up, and then we can use our bell making pliers or round nose pliers to create a hook shape, curve it back slightly, and then make a loop in the other end. Then trim the excess and close that loop. Now we can leave it as it is, or hammer it a little bit like I've done, just to match in with the focal point. Then we can use jump rings to attach our chain to each end of the focal point. Attach our clasp one end, and a jump ring at the other to hook it onto. And our bracelet is finished. If you enjoyed this video, why not head to this playlist for more like it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.